bin Laden worked with operatives from U.S. intelligence, the
in physics from Vanderbilt University in 1978. Jones specializes in metal-catalyzed fusion, solar energy, and archaeometry, which utilizes advanced physics methods to determine what happened in the past from available evidence. It is this approach that Jones applies in pursuing 9/11 research.
As I looked into it for myself, I realized, wait a minute, there must be other examples if fires brought these buildings down. There were no examples. And even here, I get this argument from civil engineers, you know, fires were sufficient, you know, I say, well, give me some examples then, because these buildings, we have over 100 years of history now of these steel frame buildings. And I read that nearly every one of them in their lifetime has a fire, major fire. There had been a huge inferno in a building in Spain. And you could see it 24 hours, you know, burning, burning, burning. The people thought it was going to collapse because the World Trade Centers buildings had collapsed. It did not. And you look at it, and the steel beams and all concrete, I mean, sure, it was damaged dramatically, but the structure is there, the frame is still there. And that's the case in all other buildings, you know, the structure remains. So I thought, that is really strange. We need to look at the evidence, the structural steel. If somehow that failed due to fire, we really want to know. This has never happened before in a high-rise steel frame building. So let's get the steel. And there were a number of people who said, we need to do a forensic analysis. We need to start putting it together, figuring out just how these connections, how the columns failed. You know, what's going on? We have to understand this. I mean, there's many buildings like this, hundreds of buildings like this, we've got to understand so that this doesn't happen again.
3 government reports were released: the well-known 9/11 Commission report, the NIST report, and the FEMA BPAT report.
It was totally inadequate. The BPAT study was, for the size of this disaster, I mean, these are the 2 largest buildings in the world as far as the Twin Towers go, 2 of the largest buildings in the world to collapse. And yet we were throwing at it volunteer engineers with no money and no authority, basically.
The only access they had was one guide, they described as a guided tour. They didn't even look at a single piece until like a month after the attack.
There was no NIST investigation. There was no $16 million. There was no federal look at this disaster other than the federal BPAT, and that's why we're very critical of BPAT. Again, not the individuals conducting it, but the way it was being conducted. It was, again, failed, you know, to do what really needed to be done, and it stopped very short of what this disaster deserves.
It's a very well-designed building, you know. Leslie Robertson and those gentlemen did a good job designing it, actually. It's not hollow. I get that argument from some people. They say, well, it's hollow, you know, it's just weird. It's like a can, a soda pop can. You know, no, it's got these huge core columns going up the center. This huge antennas, what, about 350 feet tall, is sitting on the core columns.
Kevin Ryan was a former manager for Environmental Health Laboratories, a water testing subsidiary of Underwriter Laboratories, or UL. UL certified the original World Trade Center steel and performed steel tests for the NIST report. Months after being promoted to site manager of his division, Kevin Ryan was fired for publicly questioning the NIST draft report released in October of 2004.
They were given an award in 1971 by the American Society of Civil Engineers as being the greatest engineering achievement, the greatest contribution to engineering in mankind. So, the American Society of Civil Engineers, right? So these were very well built buildings. John Skilling was given another award around about then by the AISC group, the American Institute of Steel Constructors. So these were award-winning buildings and award-winning engineers. John Skilling said he took all this airplane impacts and jet fuel fires into account, and that the building structure would still be there. And the reason I believe he said that is these were totally over-designed for calamities. Obviously, you're building these super high buildings, at the time the tallest buildings ever built. And they took into account aircraft impacts and jet fuel fires in their design.
With me is one of the architects who helped to design the World Trade Center, Aaron Swirsky.
Each floor by itself, it's sort of like an hermetic unit. It was designed even like for fire, that there were shutters that would shut off the dots, the vertical openings, and that the fire couldn't travel from one floor to the other. Now that it has collapsed, it's really an incredible thing.
It looked on the footage, what I saw on CNN, that the plane flew straight into the building.
Straight through him, right. Yeah.
So you're saying that the building was actually designed to cope with a hole like that and still survive?
Yeah, it was designed like that. Yes, that's what happened. It was the explosion in 1993. If you remember that it opened a big hole on the structure, but it was at the end of the structure, and at that point the intent was to topple the building, to collapse. But because of the design, it didn't collapse. But now, I mean, it's unbelievable. I don't know. It's just it was designed like to withstand something like that, and that's incredible because the entire design of the building was designed around that eventuality that an accident may occur.
Now, the pancake theory requires intact concrete, a lot of mass, hitting the next floor, and then those two hit the next floor, you see? And so you would expect then from that theory, which is the official theory, as the floors pancake, you'd expect to see a whole stack of floors piled up on top of each other after the collapse is completed. Instead of a whole stack of floors, and then a spindle of the core column standing too, what you see is dust that's being produced. Now you can't have it both ways. In other words, if there's dust being produced, where's the mass that causes the collapse? And if there's a mass in the collapse, that every time one floor hits a stationary floor, or a set of floors hits a stationary floor, that'll slow the collapse down. The mass has to move out of the way to get the collapse to be rapid. In a way, it's like records on a spindle. And one record falls, and if it has enough force, it will knock the next record, and the next, and the next. Besant and Zhu looked at this, and they said, well, you have to have half the columns fail about the same time. There's 47 steel, huge, 3 feet at the base, steel columns going up the core. 47, they're interconnected. How do you get them to fail simultaneously so the core disappears?